There are two big differences when you compare the global death tolls from the First and Second World Wars. First, the raw numbers. A lot more people were killed in World War II. Estimates range between 70 and 85 million.
The second difference is who was being killed. In the First World War, most of the people who died were soldiers. But in the Second World War, most of the deaths were civilians, and many of them were either killed deliberately or as collateral damage in strategic bombings.
In this war, we see the rape of Nanking, the Blitz in London, the nightmare of Stalingrad, firestorms in Dresden and Tokyo, the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and of course, the indescribable horror of the Holocaust.
Our corner of the globe escaped the worst of the conflict, but our people still paid an enormous price. Aotearoa's soldiers, sailors and airmen suffered the highest casualty rate of any Commonwealth country other than the United Kingdom.
I'm William Ray.
I'm Lee Madiman McLaughlin.
This is the Aotearoa History Show. New Zealand troops in the Second World War had very different backgrounds to the Anzacs. Many of Aotearoa's fighting-age men had relatives who'd fought in the First World War, so they had a good idea of just how badly war could affect people.
But there was still a strong patriotic desire to fight alongside Britain. Michael Joseph Savage gave this speech just after the war was declared.
Both with gratitude for the past and with confidence in the future, we range ourselves without fear beside Britain. Where she goes, we go. Where she stands, we stand. We are only a small and young nation, but we are one and all a band of brothers, and we march forward with a union of hearts and wills to a common destiny.
10 days after that speech, the government put out a call for volunteers. It was hoping that about 6,600 men would sign up. The actual number was nearly 12,000.
Just like in the First World War, many Maori and Pacific Island men enlisted. Apirana Ngata thought the reason that Pākehā politicians hadn't valued Maori participation in the First World War was because Maori had been prevented from fighting on the front lines when that war started.
Ngata was determined that this time would be different. He pushed for the formation of a special Maori unit, the 28th Maori Battalion.
Ngata encouraged Maori men to sign up to this unit. He described fighting in the war as the price of citizenship. Its troops were organised according to tribal affiliations. At first they were led by Pākehā officers, but as the war went on there were increasing numbers of Maori officers.
The 28th Maori Battalion became one of the most famous fighting units of the entire conflict. It had a fearsome reputation both among allies and enemies. According to some sources, German General Siegfried Westphal once said, "Give me the Maori Battalion and I will conquer the world."
But the price for that fame was very high. The Maori Battalion's casualty rate was 50% higher than the average infantry battalion.
Between 1939 and 1945, 194,000 men and 10,000 women served in New Zealand's armed forces at home and overseas. In fact, some Kiwis were so keen to fight fascism that they went to serve overseas several years before the Second World War officially started. In the mid-1930s, a handful of New Zealanders volunteered to take part in the Spanish Civil War, defying the government's decision to keep out of the conflict. 4 of them were killed in battle with General Franco's nationalists, and they were the first of nearly 12,000 Kiwis to die fighting the forces of fascism.
New Zealand soldiers fought in lots of different theatres. Our pilots fought in the skies in the Battle of Britain. Our ships fought in the war's first naval battle. Later on, they helped protect the Atlantic trade routes, which kept supplies flowing to the UK.
But our first major engagement was in Greece. Several thousand New Zealand troops were deployed to Greece to help bolster the Greek army against an Italian and German invasion.
But when that invasion came, it quickly overwhelmed the Allies. During the German advance in April 1941, 300 New Zealanders were killed and 1,800 captured. Many of the survivors retreated to the island of Crete.
On May 20th, 1941, 7,700 of our troops were in Crete, waiting to be evacuated to Egypt. They were busy eating breakfast when they heard something. The men rushed outside and looked up.
Hundreds of German transport aircraft carrying thousands of elite paratroopers appeared in the skies. It was one of the first ever major assaults using airborne infantry.
For 12 days, New Zealand, British, Australian and Greek troops fought alongside the Cretan resistance under the command of Major General Bernard Freyberg, the head of New Zealand's 2nd Division.
The initial attack was mostly defeated. Hundreds of German paratroopers were shot dead before they even reached the ground.
But the Germans kept coming, and some critical mistakes by the Allies' senior officers allowed them to capture an airfield and bring in reinforcements.
The Allies were pushed back. By the 6th day, Major General Freyberg ordered a full retreat and started evacuating the island.
By the 12th day, it was all over. 6,500 Allied troops surrendered to the Germans. 2,000 Kiwi soldiers were captured and nearly 700 were killed.
But their defence had been very effective. About 6,000 German paratroopers were killed or wounded.
Hitler was so shocked by the losses that he forbade any more large airborne invasions for the rest of the war. But it was still a defeat for the Allies, and it was about to be followed by more heavy fighting.
The Kiwi soldiers who survived Crete were drawn into the fight for North Africa. Again, they suffered heavy losses. Another 2,000 of our troops were captured and sent to prison camps.
By the end of 1941, the situation looked grim. The Allies had managed to beat back the Luftwaffe in the Battle of Britain, but mainland Europe was completely dominated by the fascist powers.
About 6,000 New Zealanders had been made prisoners of war, and back home in those tough early years of fighting, New Zealand had lost hugely popular Prime Minister Michael Joseph Savage. Hundreds of thousands of people turned out to pay their respects as his body was taken from Wellington to his final resting place at Battalion Point in Auckland.
Savage was succeeded as Prime Minister by Peter Fraser. Fraser was forced to introduce conscription to keep up our contribution to the war, which is a little bit ironic given he himself had been jailed for opposing conscription during the First World War. Peter Fraser's personal experience might be part of why his government had a relatively lenient approach to the men who refused to serve, at least compared to the First World War.
Still, social stigma remained strong and reached beyond conscientious objectors to men who didn't fight but worked in reserved occupations. That's kind of unfortunate because you could argue Kiwi farmers played a vital role in keeping Britain and its armed forces fed and supplying stuff like leather and wool.
As the war went on, the government took a more active role in directly managing the economy. It passed so-called manpower regulations, which forced people to work where the government wanted them.
It was called manpower, but these laws were quickly expanded to include women. By the end of the conflict, 38,000 women were in paid work. They were making ammo and uniforms in factories and working on farms and in freezing works. A lot of Maori men and women were also swept up by manpowering. For many, it was their first experience of New Zealand's Pākehā-dominated cities.
Other women served directly in the armed forces. About 650 nurses were sent overseas, and about 10,000 women served as auxiliaries in the Air Force, Army and Navy. They were drivers, cooks, mechanics, all sorts of jobs, and their officers held ranks equivalent to the men.
Different women had different feelings about their experience of war. Some women working under manpower regulations were frustrated by the long hours and low pay of factory work or the isolation of working in rural areas. Others found the experience exciting, particularly women who served overseas. Barbara Brooks puts it like this in her book, A History of New Zealand Women. War service helped create a new mould of womanhood, independent and capable of any task or position of responsibility put before them, from unpacking parachutes to leading a women's branch of the armed services. Women discovered they were well able to do jobs previously denied to them.
This movement towards women's independence and empowerment had started long before the Second World War, but it was starting to accelerate. In 1943, the voters of Christchurch East elected Mabel Howard, New Zealand's 5th female MP. She went on to become our first ever woman cabinet minister.
In her maiden speech to Parliament, she said this: "The men of this country and of every other country have yet to realise that the whole outlook of women has changed and that they are no longer going to be the servile creatures they have been."
And Mabel Howard was right about that. But we'll save that story for another episode.
On December 7th, 1941, the war took a radical turn. The Japanese Empire launched a series of coordinated surprise attacks, including the bombing of Pearl Harbor.
Within a few months, Japan had seized an enormous chunk of the Western Pacific. Japanese soldiers were trying to push down through Papua New Guinea, and bombers were launching raids on Darwin. Now, the war seemed to be right on New Zealand's doorstep.
Many Kiwis were freaked out by the apparent threat of a Japanese invasion. You can still see bunkers we built along the coast to fight off the Japanese Navy.
But the most famous part of New Zealand's DIY defence industry was this: the Semple tank. This military masterpiece was named after the Minister of Public Works, Bob Semple, who helped design it. Yes, it was built on the chassis of a bulldozer. Yes, the armour was made from corrugated iron. Yes, it had to stop to change gears. Yes, it vibrated so much that nobody could shoot its guns accurately. And yes, it has been described by military historians as the worst tank ever built. But, as Bob Semple said at the time, I don't see anyone else coming up with any better ideas.
Luckily, the Semple tank was never tested in combat because the Japanese never even tried to invade Aotearoa. But we did face an invasion of a different kind. In 1942, New Zealand was inundated by thousands of troops from the United States of America.
Aotearoa was a vital staging point for the USA in the Pacific War. 100,000 troops ended up passing through New Zealand over the next 2 years.
For many Kiwi women, the sudden invasion of young, fit, well-paid men in uniform was, all right.
But other New Zealanders were uneasy about local women having relationships with American servicemen, particularly if those women had previously been in relationships with New Zealand soldiers who were now serving overseas. Some Kiwis adopted a saying which was popular in Britain to complain about American soldiers: overpaid, oversexed, and over here.
But most New Zealanders were fond of the Americans. Their move to join the fight was seen as the beginning of the end of the Second World War. Although, to be honest, Nazi Germany was probably already doomed thanks to Hitler's decision to invade Soviet Russia.
There were still years of hard fighting ahead. New Zealand troops fought to push the Germans out of North Africa. Then they took part in a brutal campaign for control of Italy. The battle for Cassino alone killed 343 New Zealanders and left more than 600 wounded.
Closer to home, Kiwi soldiers took part in the Pacific War. New Zealand's 3rd Division helped to liberate Guadalcanal and Mono Island, and New Zealand warships and Air Force squadrons also fought in the Pacific.
A prison camp was opened in Featherston to hold about 800 Japanese prisoners captured in the Pacific, and in 1943, 48 prisoners were killed in a riot at that camp, along with one guard.
The deaths were hushed up by military censors in case it triggered retaliation against our own prisoners of war.
Kiwi airmen and seamen were there on D-Day as the Allies launched their invasion to reclaim Western Europe from Nazi Germany. And as the Allied troops pushed through Europe, they came across evidence of the Nazis' greatest crimes.
A New Zealander called Paddy Costello led a military mission to Poland and was one of the first Westerners to see the inside of a concentration camp and speak to survivors. Those camps were just a small part of Nazi Germany's massive extermination program, targeting people it considered undesirable. That included homosexuals, disabled people, trade unionists, Roma and, infamously, Jewish people.
Jews have been a significant part of New Zealand's community ever since colonisation began.
Remember Julius Vogel? He was Jewish and he served as premier twice.
But our government blocked Jews who were fleeing the Nazis from settling in Aotearoa. We set strict rules around refugee resettlement, which were far too tough for most people to meet. Why? Well, here's a quote from New Zealand's Customs Minister, Walter Nash, talking about Jewish refugees in 1936. There is a major difficulty of absorbing these people in our cultural life without raising a feeling of antipathy to them. Basically, it was anti-Semitism. politicians with the power to change New Zealand's refugee policies were either anti-Semitic themselves or they were afraid of a backlash from anti-Semitic voters.
As a consequence, only about 1,100 Jewish refugees made it to New Zealand, and that's a low number by world standards. One was Gertie Gilbert, a 16-year-old girl from Czechoslovakia. It was my mother who was determined to get us out. The sooner the better, she said. New Zealand was one of the prized places to go, but it was incredibly difficult to get in. New Zealand didn't want us, nor did anyone else really.
Gertie was lucky. She made it to New Zealand in 1939.
But her parents were not. They were both denied entry to Aotearoa and ended up in concentration camps where they died. The war finally ended in 1945, first in Europe with the surrender of Nazi Germany, but then in Japan following the atomic bombs dropped on Nagasaki and Hiroshima.
I think most of us are used to the end of the war looking a bit like this. But when news broke in New Zealand that Germany had surrendered, the government banned public celebrations. They told everyone to wait until Winston Churchill officially announced the surrender the next day. The New Zealand Herald reported it like this: "The feeling of victory was in the air, but no one was inclined to let off steam without official authorisation."
But a few months later, when Japan surrendered, it was a different story. Here's how a guy called Jim Blundell described the scene in Auckland.
Well, the whole city went bloody mad. And the following morning, it was reputed that they swept up 5 ton of broken bottles. And that. They were rooting in the bloody house bar. They were rooting in the, you know. Oh, yeah, it was on. Yeah. It was on.
Next episode, we're going to tell you about the result of all that rooting: the baby boomers. Thanks for joining us on the Aotearoa History Show, produced by RNZ and made possible by the RNZ New Zealand On Air Digital Innovation Fund.